Helisa is currently a research scientist at Huawei, Noah's Ark Lab, which is based in London. So she works on 3D vision, and over the past 7 years, she's worked on various computer vision projects, which have ranged from generative AI through 3D scene understanding and decomposition, as well as a whole bunch of stuff in neural radiance fields. So Helisa, when you are ready, please take it away.
Thank you for the nice introduction. Yeah, I'm Helisa, and today I'm going to talk about scene understanding via semantic scene graphs. I have a computer vision background, and this will be basically mostly work that I've done during my PhD research at Technical University of Munich. So basically, first of all, to make sure we are under the same definitions, you might have heard the term scene graph or maybe not, but it has multiple definitions out there. And what is in common about scene graphs is typically that objects are nodes in a graph that describes a certain scene, while for the relationships, people have been more creative across different communities. So this can mean a hierarchy of object transformations or scene compositions, but it can also mean binary support relations between objects. While what I'm going to be referring to here, it's semantic scene graphs, which basically they are not simple binary connectors between objects, but also relationships here have a label. And this is often done to describe a certain environment, usually given in an image form. So we can see in the picture that we have a man with a red t-shirt riding the bike on the road, and this information is all encapsulated in this scene graph. So it's like a high-level description that gives us the most relevant aspects of a scene or an image. And there has been an exhaustive amount of research done in relation to scene graphs and images, and we wanted to explore with my collaborators similar things in 3D. So to make that possible, as I've outlined here in the schedule of my talk, first of all, we worked on a data set of real 3D environments to annotate it with scene graphs in 3D. Then further on, we moved to the first learn method that tries to perceive these 3D scenes and predict a scene graph from them. And further, we explored some tasks related to scene synthesis. So starting with the data set, 3D SSG extends 3R scan, which is a large-scale data set with changing indoor environments. So we have multiple instances in the same scene captured in different times. And as you can see from the graphs in this figure, we try to have a very dense relationships. We have about 500K relationships connecting 50K objects in the 3R scan data sets, and we try to be diverse with the number of semantic categories that we provide for these relationships. So a few highlights of the data set that I would like to mention here are, first of all, for the nodes, we don't have, like in a typical data set with semantic annotations that only contains like a class label per object, but instead we employ WordNet and their hierarchical definitions to obtain a hierarchy of semantic classes for every instance. For example, if something has been annotated as a sofa chair, we know that this is also a chair. So imagine if you would build your perceptual model and your algorithms tell you that, okay, this object is an armchair, but you have annotated it as chair. This will not be penalized so much as it will be penalized if you say this is a table. So we wanted to put some fairness in how these things are treated, because sometimes when people annotate, some instances get annotated more specifically than others. Second, the dataset contains 3 different kinds of attributes, static, dynamic, and affordances. And the dynamic ones are the ones that I find more interesting in this data set, as it contains changing environments. So you would like to know, for example, if you have two instances of the same room, in which one of them the door is open and in the other one is closed. So this is a way to kind of try to analyze what human activity has been going on there based on these changes. And last, but definitely not least, in a scene graph dataset, we have the relationships, and those are of three different types. Proximity, showing the relative position of objects among each other. Support, when you kind of define that how one object is supporting the other. And comparative, that can compare certain attributes, like being smaller than or same colors as, and so on. And in particular, support relationships are the ones that we put more focus to make sure that they are annotated correctly and have a diverse set. So for this particular category, we used manual annotations, and we try to make it as semantically rich as possible, because things look different depending on how they are supported. For example, clothes look different when they are hanging than when they are lying on the bed. So we thought this is a nice feature to have there. So having obtained this data set, we wanted to play around with our first task of actually learning a 3D semantic scene graph to describe our indoor environments. So basically, we start here. The input is a point cloud of a 3D scene, and we make another simplification. We assume that we have all our instances given. We know instance segmentation of this room, but without classes. So what we would call class agnostic instance segmentation. And very intuitively, for every object identified in this scene, so for every instance, we want to obtain a feature. Here we use PointNet, but you can use any other model of your choice that is maybe more recent. And we do the same for every pair of objects. Here we want to obtain the so-called edge features. And to obtain this feature, we encapsulate a bounding box that contains both these objects and their context. So both these node and edge features can be used to populate a fully connected graph, which is later on processed by a graph neural network to give us the final labels for every node and every edge. None is also a valid outcome, meaning that two instances don't necessarily need to be connected, even though we force this connection in the feature level. And one particular property that we kind of allow to happen here is that for nodes, we only allow one prediction. So this is the multi-class cross entropy, the typical classification loss. While for relationships, we want to allow multiple, because a guitar can be both on the right of the couch, but also it can be smaller than the couch. So there is no reason to restrict this to a single relationship. And therefore, we model this as a set of binary cross entropies. So for every class label, you say, is it applicable or not? And they are all independent from one another. So just to give an overview detail of how these graph neural networks work in our case, is that they operate on triplets of objects. So we need to know what are the two instances, as well as their edge, so the bounding box that connects both of them. All of this expressed in feature space of PointNet or your favorite model. And then we apply an MLP to obtain a processed feature that has propagated all information in this triplet. So all these three components have seen one another. And one does the same for every triplet. And there is an aggregation step that basically adds up and averages all features that correspond to exactly the same instance. So this guitar appears in two different connections, and we want to make sure that we see all this information aggregated together. And there is another MLP step which gives us the update of every node. And so this is one layer, and in the end of the last layer, which all layers look basically like this, we will get the final classes for nodes and for edges. So pretty straightforward. And I wanted to show some results. So how does this look like in terms of result? And we're going to focus on just one part of the graph, because I guess it's impossible to pay attention to all of these slides at once. But so the idea is that the input is as on the right, we have a 3D scene, and on the left, sorry, on the left, and then on the right, we obtain the, you see one scene graph part there. And so green edges mean that they have been a right classification, while red ones mean wrong. And we also have this light blue that shows missing ground truth, but we still predicted something there. And we realized that often misclassifications are interesting and explainable. So saying that something is a desk as opposed to a table, it's a valid thing to do. And also sometimes when ground truth is missing for some reason, we still have the network that might predict something that is true because it has seen it from other instances. Like, for example, saying that the chair is on the right of the green chair is on the right of the orange one. You can also verify it in the input scan. It's basically true. So we use the recall metric typically in this setup, because we don't want to penalize for such cases when we define the performance of the models. Okay, so I talked about before about the simplification that we had done. Like, we assumed we have 3D scenes right there waiting for us, and we also magically have instance segmentation without classes. But this is not a very realistic assumption to make. It's just an assumption you make to get started. So I wanted to show a follow-up research that some of my colleagues at TUM have done. And this is basically going towards more real-world requirements, in which they assume to have an RGBD sequence of images instead of the whole scene. And they incrementally build the geometric segmentation of it that gives us all the different parts. And as they reconstruct the 3D scene, they also build a scene graph with it. So this point cloud is extended with different nodes of different segments, which they can later identify which segments belong together, and in the same way, finally get some scene graph similar to what we were getting before. So this is just hopefully to draw some inspiration that, okay, this perception can be done incrementally and basically on real time, and fit more to a real world scenario. Okay, so after talking about the first obvious task of scene perception using the introduced data set, we thought about another fun task, that is generating a scene out of a scene graph. So basically, this is how the setup looks like. We are given a scene graph, which we describe how we want our scene to look like, and then we want a model that can generate this scene, which it's actually represented as a set of shapes and bounding boxes per object. Technically, we don't learn these shapes directly in this model, but we learn a feature that represents this shape, because it's an easier problem, and these features have been encoded beforehand with good shape encoder like AtlasNet or DeepSDF and so on. And we have a model that is actually built as a variational autoencoder architecture that has two branches. In the first branch, alongside of the class labels in the scene graph, we also add this shape features per every node. And in the latter branch, alongside of the class labels, we add bounding boxes that describe location, size, and orientation of every node. We process them into separate encoders and then fuse them together because we see that's the best way to get the most out of this network, and so that these two components interact with one another. We obtain a latent graph that contains all this information in a basically lower dimension way. And then we split them again into different branches to decode shapes and layouts and obtain our final 3D scene. And on inference time, we would actually need only the last half of this model. So from latent graphs to the end, we can take a scene graph of our choice that describes how we want our scene to be. We can sample for every node a latent vector that we have learned during this learning of this model, and we are able to generate a new scene that fulfills this scene graph criteria. And on top of that, we actually thought that since scene generation and editing are two very related tasks that go hand in hand, we added a manipulator network that operates directly on the latent graph and is capable to change certain nodes. So for example, if you already have one scene, you don't want a new one, and you just want to make a change and say, I want this sofa to be relocated to the left of the table or something, you can inform your scene graph about this and see this change happen in your final result. So I will show more or less how this happens with some examples. So I have now 4 different scene graphs, which we just wrote by hand, and we said, okay, that's how we want the scenes to look like. And now I will visualize what the model was generating for these scenes. We see that in basically in all cases, we have objects that kind of fit their class category. So chairs look like chairs, and a TV looks like a TV in the third figure. So it's a flat object. And also the relationships that we have in the graph are respected here. So we see in the first figure that the bed is on the left of the table, and this is also how the generative model placed them. And as I said, we can also do editing task here. So I'm gonna edit our scenes from left to right and see how this changes. So basically we can add a pillow on the bed, we can change the relative size of the chairs, we can relocate the TV and add a cabinet in the bathtub, next to behind the bathtub. Yeah, so basically this is how we played around with the generative task, and we saw that, okay, a semantic scene graph, it's, let's say, specific enough to make a generative task that allows you to have some freedom in where you place the objects. And we wanted to go one step further and say, okay, since we are able to generate scenes from scene graphs, why don't we try now to do a completely unconditional generation? So we don't want to have a prior saying that, okay, I want to have this scene graph and I want a scene that comes from it, but we want a generative model that actually learns patterns in our world and is able to just give us scene graphs from scratch, and then we can use our off-the-shelf models to bring these scene graphs to images or 3D or however we like. And to motivate a bit what is one benefit that we can have by modeling our world expectations, because except from playing around with scenes that we generate. And I wanted to motivate this with the following scan of a room. I would say we see here that this room looks quite tidy, and it meets our model expectations, our world expectations about a bedroom. But if I add some clutter in it, you would see that, okay, this might be something here that needs fixing. And while this might not be very easy to do if we had the point cloud with a lot of noise in there with missing data segments and so, in terms of if we look at the relationships or the scene graph instead, we would know immediately that there is something going on. So pillows cannot be on the floor, clothes should not be on the nightstand, and a bag cannot be randomly beside the bed. Because this is not what we learned in the regular scenes that we modeled with our generative model, for example. So I wanted to have this application in mind as I go back to our model on unconditional scene graph generation, because if basically what we were trying to see in this model is, besides the obvious task that I mentioned, that one can generate a scene out of randomly sampled scene graphs, so we can get basically a more a structured way to generate scenes and make sure that we have the right count of objects in there, which is harder to do directly on pixel level. There is another task that we were thinking about, which is, are we able to fit a query graph into our learned model and ask the question, is this actually an outlier, or is this a normal scene graph? So if you were to, even though we trained this model in the wild data set, which is called Visual Genome, and it contains scenes for all sorts of environments without any constraint, you can actually learn such a model in your constrained environment, defined with your rules in what you want to consider. This is regular, I need to take no action on it, and define everything else as an anomaly, and ask your agent to take action in such a case. So the way the model works is basically it represents scene graphs as a sequence of nodes and edges, and it learns an autoregressive generative model on top of them, starting with prior distribution to generate the first node based on how likely it is, what is the occurrence in this training data sets of a certain category label. And then in every step, what we do is we generate a new node based on all the previous history of nodes that we have, which for now is just a bike. So we place the new node tree there, and we then reason about the relationship that connect the tree to all previous objects. And we do this for every step. And in this way, we actually build up a scene graph until we reach an end of sequence token where we know that, okay, now we have to stop. And so the question is, how do we use this learned model now to detect an anomaly? And we found that you can feed a scene graph at hand, like, which you can call a query graph, to this learned model. And in each of these steps here, you obtain an estimate of how likely it is to get this ground truth label that you have in your query graph, given all previous nodes in the previous steps. And you can, by doing this, you can accumulate a total value of negative log likelihood as a measure of anomaly. And we found that one can build a distribution for negative log likelihood values. We can do so for the ground truth, which is marked here in blue, but we also can incrementally corrupt our data set and see what happens. And we see that this negative log likelihood distribution, first of all, it shifts towards the right, and it gets wider. So one practical way to kind of define when a certain scene graph defines an anomaly or a surprise is basically by checking if it fits in the distribution of the ground truth, or if it's an outlier. So if we look at the example on the right, we see a scene graph that is actually taken from the visual genome dataset. So it's as close to a ground truth as it can be, even though it does have random annotations like a nose that doesn't really fit the rest of the nodes. So we see that here everything is closable. So we have a plane that has wings on it and is a fence on front of it, and it has a wheel and a tail. So we get a value of 5.8 that is more or less fitting the blue distribution of NLL. And if we corrupt one of the nodes and replace it with a giraffe, the NLL increases to about 9 because the giraffe cannot have wheels. And if we replace this with a banana, then this becomes even more weird because there's nothing here that makes sense anymore, like having a banana, having a fence in front of a banana. So basically, we can see how increasing also like the corruption, not just in number of nodes, but also the edges are there to control that more chaos comes as we change a label to something that makes even less sense to be there semantically. So I would like to conclude here, and I hopefully showed how semantic scene graphs are a powerful representation for perception. And we started by showing this large-scale data set with changes, which we annotated with dense relationships. And we showed how we can, using this data set, we can do scene perception beyond object instances and capture interactions, which is particularly handy for tasks like generation, manipulation, and also I hopefully drew some inspiration on how one can identify scenes that fall outside of the expected distribution so that we are able to take a certain type of action based on what we perceive to be like not normal or that needs to be fixed. So that's it. I would like to thank all my collaborators, and I thank everybody for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Helisa. Are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you for a great talk. And I'm a little afraid that it might be very minor and stupid questions, but
There's no stupid questions. Don't worry.
So in your slide, when you show the scene graph, there are some relationship like right or left or behind, such things that depend on to the camera position. And I think it will provide some degrade the model quality as the model should be dependent to the viewpoints, like such as if some table is positioned in left hand, some chair is in right. But if we change it the camera position, then the relationship be altered. And so the question is that does this really affect the model's quality and results? And is there any some approach to overcome this problem, like some possibly destroying the symmetry?
So actually, when we do this task in 3D, we actually don't assume like a certain camera viewpoint or direction. We define it in the 3D level. So basically, when we feed our 3D scenes there, we basically never rotate the objects or the parts of the scene. They are always taken from the same point of view. So for particular scene, we have a set of consistent orientations, left, right, behind, and so on. And therefore, this ambiguity is not there.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, there's another question back here.
Thank you for a great talk. I was wondering that the scene graph may require more generalizations. Maybe it can be achieved like foundation models or large language models. But the question is, how can one integrate those models with scene graphs or scene representations? Can you suggest some ideas, maybe?
Good question. So yeah, it's true that these language-based models have a crazy good performance because there's a lot of data available, and you generalize better. You cover basically all keywords that you need to cover in language, while for scene graphs you're restricted to what you annotated initially. I think there are works out there already that are trying to. So the task is image generation from a scene graph, and I think what they try to do there is they try to incorporate scene graph latent in the latent of a diffusion model, for instance, that is learned by language. So you exploit all this knowledge of language of the world that this has been trained, these diffusion models have been trained with, but also you want to have the benefits of incorporating this scene graph there in the latent representation, so that you are able to be more, let's say, specific about what you want, and have this more structured way of querying for your images. And I think these papers show that it's adding a scene graph is particularly useful for counting stuff, because text fails at giving you exactly 3 cows and not 4 in the image. But if you have a scene graph, then this is kind of more solidly enforced, because you have the nodes there and you cannot just ignore them. So I think there has been already works that try to exploit the benefits of both words, like the generalization of language and this insane amount of data, and on the other hand, the structure of the scene graphs.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Helisa. I think we will stop the questions just for you here, and we'll move on to the panel session. So can everybody please join me in thanking Helisa?